Hello and welcome to another lecture for the New Zealand Regional Debate Development Series. This lecture I'm about to do is going to chat you through how to frame. So I assume at this point you've probably watched a lot of other lectures before. This is just one of the later lectures in this series that you should probably watch. And you've probably heard me tell you, I'm going to cover this in my later framing video. So as promised, I'm actually going to teach you how to do it now. I think this will be a big help to lots of debaters, because, knowing how to frame is very useful to do. However, before I start, I would like to give you the very brief advice that listening to these are great, taking notes are even better, so get your pen and paper out. And as always, practicing them afterwards helps a lot and helps you develop them into your actual regular debate usage. Okay then, without further ado, let's jump into framing. Framing. Where and when do you use it? When do you use it is the first question. You should use it at the start of your first speaker's speech. Not in the first speaker's speech structure, I chat through when you should use it. It's after your intro, right? But it's before you get into your substantive points, right? Some people will do it before their model, some people will do it after their model. Either is totally fine, but just make sure it's kind of up the top there. The earlier in the debate it is, the less messy it makes it. Can you use framing later on? I've seen lots of people at second, lots of people at third use framing very effectively in the debate. However, I think that framing makes debates very messy. It can make them very murky. And if you're already doing lots of things right because of the videos you've watched earlier, you're already probably doing very well in the debate. So I'm not going to chat through how you frame deep into a debate, because I think that's probably just a more complex issue that this lecture can't cover. But you should learn this whether you are a first speaker, a second speaker, or a third speaker, because in the prep room it is definitely something you should be talking about that's going into your first speech. Why then should you use framing? Of course, you should use framing because Elliot told you in his videos that you should use framing in your first speech. But for some of you, I understand that may not be a good enough a reason. So, the reason we use framing is to shift the goalpost of the debate a little bit, to kind of tilt the field. It's like playing soccer on a tilted field. It makes it much easier for your team to win, right? I've heard it described as a way to win debates without having any points. I think the people at Manchester described it as that. I'd like to say that's a little bit of an overstatement in my opinion. However, I agree with them in the fact with what they were actually trying to say, which is that it is very, very important for winning debates, especially when you get into higher levels of debate. So, let's get on to our next slide. How do we actually frame? Firstly, I'd like to say, I'm going to chat you through these 3 steps, and you're going to be like, I still am really confused, because framing is a little bit airy-fairy in the way you describe it. So on the next slides, I'm going to give you some examples that will hopefully crystallize in your brain. So right now, just take those notes down, make sure you're listening as well as possible to these steps, and then when we get to it, the examples will hopefully give you any clarity that you're missing. First step, make a claim. Pretty much just assert something about the world, make a statement about it. This is the problem though. Lots of debaters stop here. They say such and such is true about China, or is true about New Zealand politics, etc. And if it's a true thing, that's fine. That's something we just know that's a fact. But if it's a gray area, that's not really enough, especially if you want to tilt it in your advantage. The judge is probably not going to let you get away with it. So make the claim. But the second step is super important. You need to give me some mechanisms and examples why that is true. So use a little bit of debaters sometimes call these examples intuition pumps. So just if someone calls it that, you know why they're calling it that. So intuition pumps are you say, obviously this is true because such and such does X, or we can observe this when such and such does Y, and then use mechanisms to kind of explain out why that is a demonstration of these characteristics. Also, use mechanisms in the traditional way to ask yourself why this is true, and you want to reason that out as much as possible. The more unsure or gray the area, the more you want to reason it out, especially against better teams, because they're also going to be trying to reason out something different, probably. Impacting. not the impact we're talking about at the end of your points. This is about the impact this has on the debate. You need to sit down and say, okay, Judge, what is it that this actually does to the debate? What does it change? How should you view the debate differently now that you believe my frame? Okay, stay with me now. Here's the example that's going to make this make sense. Example. Let's say the motion is this House would, let's just say as New Zealand, just to make it simple, because you guys are probably watching in New Zealand, make a military deal with the US. Let's say we're side negating. We're like, no, you definitely shouldn't make a military deal with the US. What's our claim? These are not our points, but let's make a statement that's going to make it easier to win. The other side is probably going to be talking a lot about how it's going to protect us from Chinese invasions or military interventions. So we want to make them think that that's not going to happen. Judge the debate on something else. So our claim is China is on great terms with New Zealand, so great they would never invade us. That's our claim. Big, broad statement. Does the judge believe it? Not yet, but they will in a moment. What are our mechanisms for this? Well, we say to the judge, one, we do a lot of trade with China. Relative to we do a lot of trade relative to all of our other partners. We sell them lots of things. We buy quite a lot of things from China. That makes them money. It gives them goods they want. They like us a lot. However, I understand that they might say that we're a small nation. So the specific things we trade are particularly wealthy, good items. Because New Zealand is a very reasonably wealthy first world nation, it means that we buy things like, computer processing systems and hardware chips from China, which are not things that other nations buy from them. And this helps them become a more developed, advanced economy. So China likes nations that do that particularly. As well as that, they buy very expensive items from us. They buy things like Manuka honey and New Zealand milk, etc. And these are highly marked up luxury goods in China. And that means the kind of upper 10% of Chinese wealth buy these things. That means that the Chinese wealthy are in the support of New Zealand. They don't want their nice things cut off from them. So those are a lot of mechanisms. Are those things all true? Pretty much. They're pretty believable to a judge. Are they exactly true? That's on the borderline. I think it's up for debate. This is why this is a gray area, and how much influence that has is a gray area. So you probably need to walk the judge through that more and more if it becomes contested. Then I'm like, what impact does this have on the debate? I'm going to say to the judge, look, this means, judge, that whatever the affirmative team was just telling you about Chinese invasion and China being a militaristic threat to us, that's not what this debate should be about. That's kind of irrelevant, as I've just told you. So they don't have an incentive for that. It's now about whether we should want US or China trade. Because if we take this US military base, maybe they weren't thinking to invade, but it'll still make them mad and not want to trade with us. So we need to weigh up which one of those trading partners is more important to us as a nation. And that right there is a lot easier to win than it is to win on New Zealand military can take the Chinese military without US support. That's never going to be a debate you win. That makes sense, hopefully. However, often when I give this explanation, I hear a lot of debaters say to me, oh, that sounds really obvious. Which means it's probably a pretty good example because the judge is buying it and you are buying it. However, I'm going to do the flip side now, not in as much detail as I've done here, but just to talk you through what might be the other side, because sometimes your brain kind of seizes up and it's hard to think about what might be the other side of framing once you've heard one side. So let's flip to the other side of that. What is the example for the other side of that? So we're still doing the same motion. This helps with making military deal with the US. Let's say you're on side affirmative this time. Your claim is China is super aggressive and militaristic in the region. This means that maybe they're not likely to attack New Zealand today, but over the next 10 to 15 years, we think this could definitely be part of their long-term strategy. What are our mechanisms for this? We would say things, you could theorize out why these might be true yourself, but obviously you need to talk them through in the debate. You might say things like their activity in the South China Sea. You might talk about their activities around Taiwan. You might talk about the US military strategy that acknowledges we're part of the third island chain, for a Chinese invasion plan, what they expect. All of these things paint China as a super aggressive actor. way more than they actually are, but it's super believable for a judge. The impact on the debate you tell the judge is, look, China is actively becoming a really big threat in this region to nations' independence. Not ours at the moment, but viably definitely could be ours in the long term. So because of all that, don't listen to them about how we might lose a trading partner. We should be worried about losing our independence and going to war. And the judge is like, wow, that sounds like I should judge the debate. So if either side frames one of these things, we're having two very different debates. Each one is very much easier for either side affirmative to win or side negating to win. Perfect. Let's go to the next slide. Rebuttal framing. This is a little bit more complicated, but it's very similar concept, so hold out. Rebuttal framing is pretty much just where the other side frames something. If they frame something that's totally fine, you're like, it doesn't mess with our path of victory, we can still win the debate. Go for it. That's fine, because sometimes teams will frame things that aren't actually that important to the debate. It happens often. They miss the mark, they guess what you're going to do wrong. However, if it's interfering severely with the debate, you're like, oh my gosh, how are we going to win this debate now? You need to counterframe. You need to stand up in your rebuttal in either your first, negating speech or your second affirmative speech. So do this as soon as possible. Do not leave it to third speakers. Do not leave it to leaders' replies. It's too late. You need to deal with it as soon as it's coming out, as early at the top to make it nice and clean. When that happens, what you want to be doing is just counterframing. You say, okay, you said China's aggressive. Here's why it's not. Give a bunch of mechanisms, right? If you're really good, you should be able to drag them all the way across the other side and flip that analysis and be like, wow, China's not aggressive at all, which is great. That's super useful to you. But even if that's not the case and we come back a little bit, you're still doing a very good job that's massively helpful to you in the debate, because at least by contesting it, by giving your own claim, your own mechanisms, and your own impact on the debate, following the same steps, you're at least making this a muddy issue again. It's unclear in the judge's mind, which means you're much more able to just make a fair debate and win on that, right? So you at least want to be engaging with this if it's going to be harmful to your case. Perfect. Bonus tips. Please be reasonable when you frame, because often I teach debaters this and they're like, oh, I can just say anything when I frame and it's going to make debates so easy to win. And I'm like, no, you can say some things that make debates easier to win. You cannot say anything. One, do not tell your judges explicit lies. I tell you this a lot, but debaters do it way too often. So for example, don't tell the judge that the Chinese military has actively declared war against New Zealand. I don't care how good your framing is, they're not going to believe you. Because the average voter hasn't read in the newspaper that China's declared war recently. So be reasonable. You're also not allowed to do something that is kind of out of the spirit of debating, which kind of comes under the same reasonable thing again. Very similar to motion swirling in the way you would set up a motion that makes it unwinnable. You shouldn't be doing something like this that makes it unwinnable. It should just, I think a good question is, does this make it unwinnable for the other side? If so, probably wasn't the way the debate was meant to happen, so the judge just thought about it. If it slants the playing field, that's totally fine. Now, my favorite tip, my favorite bonus tip for you guys is please practice this. Go sit down, pick out a motion. You can either do this in groups if you're at a debate club. You can do this as individuals if you're working by yourself. And pick any motion. Some motions are less conducive to framing. So if you're like, oh, I'm not really sure I can frame with this one, just give another one a go. With more practice, almost lots more motions will become easier to frame. But at the start, it will seem like there's not many. So take a motion, practice it, write out all these steps, make sure you go through and tick every box, and frame out something that you think will help you in the debate. Perfect. With that said, that's the end of the framing lecture. I would like to say that, of course, framing is a large and complicated issue. This does not cover every facet of it. There are a number of things I've left out. Because to teach all of the ways you could frame would be impossible to ever fit into one video. But this is the most common ways, the most effective ways to frame it. I think that you use them in your debating. It's definitely one of the hardest skills to integrate. But once you do it, I think, look, like if the people at Manchester Debate Union say it helps you win debates without making arguments, you can probably infer that it's a pretty good thing to have in your debating arsenal, even if that's a bit of an overstatement. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments. I will do my best to get back to them at some point. Otherwise, enjoy your week, enjoy your debating, and I wish you all the best of luck for your next debate.